Hello! I decided to make this video after I saw the reception of a podcast segment that I and my colleague Connor hosted on YouTube. After we criticised a United States Supreme Court decision, Ashcroft versus Free Speech Coalition, which we interpreted as permitting the creation of transgressive forms of pornography that feature child abuse, as long as it was drawn and involved no real minors, we had some considerable pushback, with many accusing of us wanting to punish people for victimless crimes. So it seems that there was a major disagreement with how some of our audience and Connor and I perceived these acts, with special pushback reserved for Connor's position that all online porn should be banned. Now, I don't know enough about the arguments for and against banning porn entirely, so for a more in-depth discussion on that, I would direct you to this debate that Connor and Josh had on the subject. For a quick summary, Connor argued for banning porn mainly due to the abuses that occur within the industry, the inability for consumers to verify the content that was made consensually, and the psychological damage it causes to its consumers, and Josh argued against banning it because he said it would drive the business underground and exacerbate any abuse issues that are already present, and fail to eliminate the psychological desire for this content. It's very interesting, so I would highly recommend it, but I do want to explore the concept of victimless crimes and whether such a concept really exists, at least when concerning vices that can grip people and how that affects those around them. I do not want to continue the discussion on whether the Supreme Court's decision on Ashcroft v Free Speech Coalition was the correct one. I simply want to explore the moral arguments around them from a realist and hopefully non-idealistic perspective. I feel like I've not sufficiently explored the arguments around the pros and cons of banning certain things, so instead I'll be addressing the general moral permissiveness that some people have towards what I consider to be harmful behaviours, and how this can spill out into greater society. So this isn't a legal critique, but it is a social one. The concept of a victimless crime has existed for a long time, and in contemporary thinking it can be traced back to the likes of Lysander Spooner and his text, Vices Are Not Crimes. The idea is that a victimless crime is one where either no one is directly physically harmed, but society doesn't approve of the act, like the transaction between a prostitute and her client, or where the only person directly harmed is the individual themselves, like when a person takes hard drugs. My major contention with this is that this idea of the victimless crime is centred on a presupposition which is known as John Stuart Mill's harm principle. Now, I don't agree with this principle and consider it to have fostered some attitudes that have caused many of the problems that we see around us today, mainly by implanting a live and let live mentality in a lot of people. To really get to the base of what I'm talking about, we'll need to start by analysing this harm principle and see if it actually stands up to scrutiny. John Stuart Mill articulated his harm principle in his famous work on liberty, which was a defence of free speech. Quote, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilised community against his will is to prevent harm to others." Unquote. While I understand his intention here, which is the minimising of harm, I do feel that this is an inadequate principle to fully organise a functional society around. It only takes into account the immediate, direct physical harm that comes from people's actions, and has no room to consider the cultural and psychological damage that can develop over time when societies embrace negative and harmful behaviours. And this narrow definition of harm as only direct physical harm opens the floodgates, allowing all sorts of previously forbidden behaviour. Harm can be interpreted in reality as many different things in many different circumstances, and how exactly the principle should be applied in theory isn't clear, but as far as I can tell, the only way it's applied practically is any authority telling me I shouldn't do something that I want to do is evil.
So unfair!
Clearly, this definition is limited, as it can still be coherently applied in papers like this, which argue for expanding the notion of harm to encompass harmful speech. thereby allowing governments to censor it. And seeing as Mill established his harm principle to defend free speech in the first place, this seems like a major failing in the wording and spirit of his definition. This half-baked principle has provided a philosophical justification for the slippery slope our civilization has found itself on. I understand, though, this idea that as long as something only causes harm to the individual, doing it means that you can brush it aside is enticing. It gives us wiggle room to ignore and dismiss our responsibilities to those around us. But consider this. How moral are we if we see someone we care about suffering by their own hand and say nothing? If your friend or family member is shut away from the world and does nothing but indulge in pornography and video games, is that not a type of harm he's inflicting on himself, even if it's not directly physical? By doing nothing, are we enabling and implicitly endorsing their own self-destruction? And even further, can we actually say for certain that no one outside of that person is harmed if a sizable chunk of society all decide to opt out at the same time as well? Can we claim to be upholding our values if we don't at least say something? I don't think we can. Change may be an internal process and can really only come down to whether the individual wants to change or not, but it is harder to take that first step without genuine support and encouragement from others. Acknowledging that this is a societal problem makes what I think even clearer. I'm not happy to sit back and watch my culture die just on the principle of, well, it's not hurting anyone, is it?
What's the big deal? It doesn't hurt anybody.
The road to Drag Queen Story Hour started when people said what a consenting adult does behind closed doors is their own business, but evidently it doesn't stay behind closed doors, and now it's out on the street, in our schools, and it's indoctrinating our children. The widespread embrace of this permissive mindset is exactly what the left wing has needed all this time so they can overturn and subvert everything you love, destroy your culture, and dishonour your ancestors, all while those preaching tolerance say, oh well, no harm done. An additional point to bring to the table that Connor made is that by purely focusing on harm reduction, this principle ensures that we ignore the promotion of virtuous behaviours. Is it not playing into exactly what our enemies want to do this? Leftists say that, for instance, they want to reduce harm done to children by educating them on sexual matters at a younger age, which they say will lead to a healthier view on sex as they get older. And now, within their own ideology, that may sound logically consistent. It might even sound reasonable enough to anybody who doesn't follow that ideology. But what it turns out is that we don't live in ideology. We live in reality, where people don't share all of your values and actively hate you for wanting a simple and wholesome life. And the harm principle is invoked as a smokescreen, as harm-focused phrases like healthier view on sex actually turn out to mean more desensitized to extreme sex and fetishes at an earlier age, which does not sound healthy to me. By stepping back, we think we are avoiding involving children in politics that they don't understand, when what we're actually doing is opening the door for somebody else to raise your children with their values. We've seen this happen across schools in the West, like the US and the UK. Permissiveness allows others to indoctrinate our children when we need to uphold and promote healthy virtues that we know work. Another problem we run into doesn't just apply to this discussion, but afflicts many of the ideas that originate from academia and government, and that is the harm principle is often applied from the comfortable position of those who don't have to live with the consequences of their ideas. Think of Patrisse Cullors, former Black Lives Matter leader and co-founder, who cried for cities to defund the police. She said the only reason that certain neighbourhoods have so much crime is because over-policing causes over-reporting. The core of this argument was that the harm done by over-policing was greater than whatever harm would come from defunding them. It's a nice theory, but real experience proved that defunding the police actually caused massive spikes in violent crimes. But from her cosy mansion, the idea that removing police presence in these neighbourhoods might reduce crime seems almost plausible. Similarly, you can argue that using drugs doesn't harm anyone but yourself, but this never stands up to scrutiny either. I'd go ahead and say it's an outright lie. No man or woman exists in a vacuum. We live in a society where we all depend on our relationships to each other, and your actions will have consequences that you can't predict. And we have inherited a culture and the burden of stewardship of that culture so we can pass the blessings that we benefited from onto future generations. This is a responsibility that many are abdicating, and given the current state of things, I understand why so many opt out. The totality of institutional and state power is stacked against you if you hold traditional values, and those traditional values are actively looked down upon. But choosing to give up is just that, it's giving up. You can still live a meaningful life despite the deck being loaded against you, and it starts with conquering your vices and not making yourself a burden on others. Consider this for a moment. You may not think it harms anyone but yourself when you take harmful drugs, but how true is that? How does it affect your relationships? How do your friends react to your behaviour? Are you encouraging them to take up the same harmful habits that you have? It may be keeping your parents up at night. It may be causing your friends stress and affecting other aspects of their lives because they care about you. You're not an island, and to pretend otherwise is to lie to yourself. And now that I've covered the harm principle, I'm going to move on to my main contention with the above mentioned YouTube comments. Transgressive pornography that is drawn rather than filmed depicting children or women designed to look like children. Now, some argue that this does not have a direct attributable harm on any individual and therefore can be morally excused or just brushed aside. But change the framing and you might consider it differently. Would you think the same if it was a drawing of your daughter? If you're not a parent, if it was your niece or nephew? Would you begin to see things differently if it was someone you cared about? There's an entire industry engaged in using deepfake technology to edit real people's faces onto the bodies of porn stars, so it's not impossible that this could happen to somebody that you care about. And now consider, would you want to spend time with someone you knew who engaged with this media? Just because someone only does something behind closed doors doesn't mean it doesn't reflect who they are or affect their character. If you found out your best friend was a furry or someone who watched pornographic cartoons of women who look like children, would you look at them differently? I think it's impossible to say that even if you approve of this behaviour or just don't care, it still wouldn't change how you see them. It definitely would change how you see them.
We're gonna draw a little bit of everybody's blood. We're gonna find out who's the thing.
Furthermore, the idea that this kind of material doesn't affect people is honestly a pleasant myth that many people tell themselves. All it takes is a quick look through the male to female Reddit forum to see how many people have developed their new gender identity through engaging with transgressive pornography as they become desensitized by more and more extreme material. And denying this would just be dishonest. There's an entire field of psychotherapy known as exposure therapy, where patients are exposed at first to an unrealistic depiction of their fears and are gradually introduced to more and more real versions as a mean of overcoming that fear. So if you can desensitize someone from their fears, you can desensitize people to vices as well. And as a society, the more we normalize this, whether you introduce excuses or not, like the classic, well, actually, this character from this anime is actually 10,000 years old and she just happens to look like an 8-year-old, so sexualizing her is fine. The more we normalize the sexualization of real children. You cannot ignore the connection between these types of attitudes and the spilling out into real life that we're seeing right now. Aristotle said that people's virtues lie in their habits, that you are what you do and not what you say. So however you may behave in public, how you act behind closed doors will still affect who you are otherwise. For example, most men report that watching pornography leaves them feeling ashamed and mildly disgusted with themselves. That's not just a coincidence. That's not you feeling something funny. That's your unconscious mind's natural way of telling you that what you are doing is not good for you, and maybe you should listen to it. And difficult as it can be to kick a bad habit, it leaves more room in your life to focus on what's good for you. I just want to clear up that in making this video, I'm not claiming to be a paragon of virtue myself. I'm not trying to lay down an immutable principle that can be applied to all situations universally. I don't think such a thing can exist, which is why Mill's harm principle is such a problem when people try to apply it in such a way. I have my own vices, like we all do, but I'm not looking to make excuses for them. And I'm not saying that we need to start passing arbitrary laws banning things either. Should the authorities be prioritised in apprehending the consumers of illegal priority instead of the producers of it, first and foremost? Of course not. I simply want to highlight that the moral permissiveness we currently allow as a society is damaging, most of all to the people who engage with the addictive vices that you're encouraged to use by every corporation, state organisation, and media talking head. You're easier to control when you're an atomised, drug-addicted Kuma. We need to apply our standards confidently as a way to push back against this and say, actually, I don't think it's good that you're doing that. Sometimes you've got to be cruel to be kind when it's appropriate. Continuing on the trend of where we're going right now isn't going to help anyone. So if you're someone who struggles with these or similar vices, please seriously consider speaking to someone and getting help. If you're not ready for that yet, perhaps ask yourself next time you're thinking of indulging in this type of bad behaviour, whether drugs or pornography or anything else, would my mum be proud if she knew I was doing this? Even if you don't have a relationship with your parents, think of a role model that you admire. They don't need to be real, they can be fictional. Just think of someone who you think exemplifies virtue and good behaviour and ask, would they want this for me? It might help you to moderate your urges in the future. You can push aside these distractions and focus on good and continual self-improvement. I sincerely hope that you can develop the discipline that you need to live your best life in the future. And thank you very much for watching.